Hello, my name is Andrew Keane. Welcome to Keane on America, the daily show about everything that matters, with the world's leading commentators and thinkers. Hello everybody, live Keen On show today from the DLD conference. I moderated an interesting panel on innovation, regulation and geopolitics, a panel about how to accelerate Europe's competitive future, a perennial theme in Europe, particularly at DLD. One of my panelists was Marta Mucznik, who works at the International Crisis Group, and Marta has a particular take on power in Europe. Marta, would it be fair to say that for Europe to accelerate its competitive future, it needs to recognize the nature of power in the 21st century?
Yes, I think very much so. I think it needs to recognize, but I think it already recognizes. And I think in Europe we speak a lot about wake-up calls. Several world events are often wake-up calls for Europe to get its act together and come to a policy, to decisions, to more assertive role on the global stage. But I think that's also what the full-scale invasion of Ukraine really represented for Europe and the Europeans, and the EU as an institution is really how it can build strategic autonomy, how it can be more self-reliant, less dependent on the United States for its own security, and projecting power is the language of today's world, and Europe is navigating this transition from this transition that we observe at a global stage, right? The global order that really is transitioning from, or seems to be shifting from, a focus on rules, multilateralism, restraint, to a world where dominated by a geopolitical competition, where the world is carved out into spheres of influence, where the language of power seems to matter more and norms and rules seem to matter less. So Europe has to adapt to this transition. And in order even to be competitive, it has and it has to project power. And so this is a critical issue for Europe right now, is to learn the language of power, and to learn to adapt to this new reality.
Marta, I wasn't as forthright on the panel as I'm going to be now. I appreciate your honesty. You're very direct, and yet you work for the International Crisis Group, which is a progressive human rights group in many ways. Are you suggesting in your own way that Europe needs to rearm, to focus itself not just on the immediate threat from the Russians in Ukraine, but the longer term threat of China and perhaps even the United States? Is power for you military power?
I think, there's a famous saying in Europe that in order to have peace, you need military power, right? Or I don't know exactly how the saying goes. So yes, International Crisis Group is a conflict prevention and conflict resolution organization. We work with 50 conflicts. We monitor 50 conflicts around the world, and obviously the primary goal of International Crisis Group is to prevent and end a deadly conflict. This is our primary concern and raison d'être. And so we want to promote and recommend policies that help the world become a more peaceful world. And But obviously, when we say that Europe, when I say, this is my own personal take on things, I'm not speaking necessarily on behalf of Crisis Group, but when I say Europe has to adapt more, it's precisely so that it can continue to promote its value-based foreign policy. But in order for its value-based foreign policy to be credible, it has to be sustained by military power, and it has to have the ability also to deter threats such as the Russian threat in its vicinity. And so what we often advocate is this combination between deterrence and diplomacy. But in order for diplomacy to work, you need also to have credible deterrence against external threats.
And so what exactly does that mean? Are we talking about EU rearmament? Are we talking about Germany? Are we talking about the UK, which of course is no longer part of the EU? Should there be a common European defense fund of some sort, perhaps replacing NATO?
I think we're talking about Europeans becoming more independent because it's not that Europeans in some ways have outsourced their own security either to the United States or to NATO. And they no longer can rely on that. And so they need to build their own defense capacities. I don't know if that's through Europeans coming together and building their own defense fund, as you mentioned, or a common army. I mean, there's huge debates on this across Europe. There are many different opinions. I don't have a particular opinion on that. I think it's very much through NATO, and Europeans can act. Maybe also it was mentioned in the panel that we've just participated in through coalitions of the willing, through like-minded countries that agree on the nature of the threat and have the same worldview, coming together to build coalitions of the willing, the way, for example, it's happening now in Europe with France and the UK leading on the response to the war in Ukraine, and how to think about the types of security guarantees that the Europeans can provide to the Ukrainians in the event of a peace deal or a ceasefire deal, that no longer, that they take responsibility for security guarantees that are no longer just dependent on the United States. I think those are the big issues that Europeans are grappling with at the moment.
I thought one of the most interesting things you noted or warned about was the structural problem of the EU, suggesting that because there are so many quote-unquote countries within it, it's actually very, very hard to put together some sort of even a common defense fund, and certainly a consensus on the idea of power. This is a subject, of course, which many people have talked about endlessly. In your view, does that make the EU, in the long term perhaps, not a viable institution, and perhaps we're going to see the fragmentation of Europe back to nation states, especially when it comes to the issue of power and being able to stand up to foreign aggressors of one kind or another?
I mean, I think that's what the enemies of the EU would like it to happen, right? The fragmentation, the polarization, the disintegration, if you will, of the EU as an institution. I think that I don't think that that's a likely scenario for the near future. I think that probably the answer lies in a combination of things. The EU coupled with coalitions of the willing that can come together and agree on certain things. I think the Europeans have to be more flexible in the way they approach their challenges and their threats. I think obviously this is one of the biggest debates in Europe, right? And the lack of sometimes convergence in terms of threat perceptions as well at the European level, and the lack of urgency that each country attributes to the threats that they've identified. You have, various debates. But I do think that the mainstream view of the Europeans is still, and at the EU leadership and the EU institutions is still dominated by a certain belief that Europeans can come together, or at least a majority of Europeans can come together, and there's still, there's somewhat of a convergence of views around the goals of the EU and what its external action should be. Now, of course, there are many challenges with the rise of the far right in Europe, with polarization, with far-right parties increasingly dominating or participating in more governments across Europe, and that's definitely a big challenge facing Europe.
Marta, I'm guessing, and perhaps correct me if I'm wrong, that politically you're certainly not on the radical right, you're more of a progressive. Certainly not someone who would associate themselves with the far right. However, having said that, given your premise that Europe needs to essentially wake up and recognize the centrality of power, could one argue that the only political groups in Europe able, capable, willing of addressing this issue of power, for better or worse, are radical right-wing groups in Germany, Italy, Spain, France, the United Kingdom?
I mean, that's a tough one. I don't think so. No, I don't.
Well,
I don't
it's
think
a tough one because perhaps we don't like the answer.
No, but I don't think it's the radical right who's, I don't think it's the radical right or the far right the only political force responsible. And I'm not. We're an apolitical organization. I'm not.
Well, you're not here to talk on behalf anyway. Of the international crisis group.
But I think. We have many examples throughout history that center-right, center-left governments were able to project power. I don't think it's about the ideology that underpins the government that defines, whether or not one can project power or invest more militarily or invest in defense industries. In fact, there's a lot of work happening right now, especially since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, with European governments, almost all mainstream in center left, center right, doing real hard thinking on this. So I don't think this is a monopoly of the right or the left or the far right or the far left. I think I don't think there's ideology for issues of power and military capability.
Are you saying, though, that Europe needs perhaps a Bismarck or a de Gaulle, one of these nationalist politicians who recognize power? Certainly Bismarck revolutionized 19th century Europe through his understanding of power, able to unite Germany. De Gaulle was, of course, the father of the EU. Do we need a next generation de Gaulle, perhaps, to reinvent the EU in the context of your thesis about power?
I also think that I don't think nationalists are necessarily going to help very much with the current momentum that we're going through, or leaders who want to retract and become more protectionist or more nationalistic. I think Europe can be much stronger if it acts collectively. So what we do need is leaders who think at the European level, and not just nationally. And yes, you're right. I think we do need leaders with vision for the future of Europe and who can sort of rally not only just governments and member states, but also European populations around the same goals.
But don't people have to care? Don't they have to have some sense of pride in who they are in terms of whether it's French or German or Italian or perhaps European? And isn't that the problem with the EU? Is that ultimately it hasn't translated into passion, and that may explain, or it's certainly one reason why Europe has struggled so much with this idea of power.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think it's certainly part of it, but I think it's also a question that national politicians need to grapple with, especially pro-European, pro-EU project as an institution, as an actor in the world. You know, those politicians who really believe that Europe and the EU should be a strong geopolitical actor. It's up to them to sell this idea to their populations, and you see, and that's sometimes where things get lost in translation, right? Because national politicians don't sell this European idea to their own publics, but ultimately it's about national politicians and member states also doing their work with their own electorates. And if that doesn't happen at the national level, you're right that, you know, it's hard for the average European citizen to see the value of Europe. But I think, you know, there are many ways in which, I mean, I don't want to sound too catastrophic, because I do think the idea of Europe still exists and it's still valued across Europe.
Does the EU, though, in the best context, Marta, if it is to survive, doesn't it need, and you touched on this in our panel, fundamental reform? You noted that the EU was invented at a time of peace. It was designed to keep the peace of the Cold War. The world of the 2020s, and certainly of the 2030s and 2040s, will be fundamentally different. So how does the EU need to change if it's to survive?
I think it needs to change the way it works, the way it functions, obviously, and I think there's very much that realization amongst EU leaders and those that are driven by the idea of Europe and that want Europe to succeed as a project, as you know, as a geopolitical force as well globally. I think, but obviously some changes are really necessary, and reform, as you say. For example, on foreign and security policy and defense policy, it's everything is decided by unanimity, which can really sometimes derail a lot of different decisions and policies. And we've seen also that happening in the context of European Council discussions on Ukraine, for example, where sometimes decisions take too long to be taken because there are some member states who vote against or who veto and who use their power at the European Council to derail decisions. And so far the EU has managed to overcome this, but obviously it's disruptive. And if Europe needs to succeed and become the geopolitical force that it wants to be, obviously there are many people who argue that it should act quicker, more efficiently, it should take decisions faster, and maybe not by unanimity but by qualified majority voting. And you see a lot of debate around the policy areas in which this could happen.
What happens if none of this happens? Marta, as I noted on the panel, I've been coming to DLD for many years, and every year we have a conversation about how Europe needs to catch up to the United States and compete with China. And every year doesn't seem to occur. Is there a crisis point that could be reached if the things that you're talking about, leaving aside the tech, because it's not really your area, but on the political and military side, barring, of course, something catastrophic like a Russian invasion of the Baltics or of Poland?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
The question is there a crisis point which
I mean, look, I mean,
that suddenly this, I mean, at the moment,
we're waiting
all this
for
is
that.
a bit abstract, even in the context of the Ukraine war.
I mean, we're waiting for that crisis to implode. I mean, there are many. We often say we live in the moment in a time of polycrisis, right? We have climate shocks, the pandemic, the wars, and I think Europe and the EU haven't. We have not reached that point yet. We managed to somehow find solutions to the various crises that Europe was confronted with. I think we have to be more imaginative and more creative in the way we think about Europe at large. It's not just the EU, but we also have, coalitions of the willing of countries, again, like I've mentioned before, and it was mentioned in our panel as well, that if action is not possible at the EU level, with the unanimous consensus of all of its member states, a group of member states can act, together, decide on things together, decide to, let's say, for example, in the context of Ukraine, there's a big discussion on deployment of troops, if and when there's a ceasefire or a peace deal. And it's just a group of countries. It's not the EU as such. So I think we have to think creatively about how Europe can thrive in the future. And it's not just through the EU. It's through the EU and other types of other organizations, other unilateral coalitions of the willing. It's all of those things together.
So finally, Marta, what immediate changes would you recommend in terms of making Europe perhaps viable, perhaps even enabling it to survive as a democratic force, as a force for progress in the 21st century? Where should it start? Where would you begin?
I mean, I think a lot of it is already I think a lot of it is already happening. I think, as the saying goes, crisis, sharpens the minds, and I think it's really forcing the EU and Europeans to reckon with their own inconsistencies and try to overcome them. Try to, build the defense capabilities and deterrence capacities that it needs. To be able to act independently. That's a good start. But also thinking of ways to, I think, if not speak, with a single voice, but at least, have a group of countries that think alike, that have the same concerns, coming together to and act together. Because I think European countries, if they all act individually and if they're fragmented, and if there's more fragmentation, more polarization, that would be, I think, the big problem for Europe going forward.
Well, Marta, Mucznik, I appreciate your frankness. I'm not sure all Europeans will be thrilled with what you said, but you're telling them what they need to hear. Thank you so much.
Thank you.